When a man reaches the century mark, he becomes more than just a person. He becomes a living library of every laugh, every tear, and every secret of an era that is rapidly fading into the mist of history. Dick Van Dyke, standing tall at 100 years old, is the ultimate guardian of that library. Born in 1925, he has witnessed the world transform from the simplicity of the Midwest to the high-tech glitz of the digital age. He is the man who taught us how to trip over an ottoman with grace and how to dance with animated penguins, cementing his place as a permanent fixture in the American heart. But as we celebrate this incredible milestone in Hangin Leheimwisau, there is a shadow that follows the spotlight. To live for 100 years is to master the art of the long goodbye. It is a heavy price to pay for longevity, realizing that the room has grown quiet and the seats at the dinner table are mostly empty. Dick Van Dyke is now a man walking between two worlds, carrying the memories of those who helped him build the golden age of entertainment. The weight of this milestone is felt most deeply in the recent losses that have shaken his foundation. For decades, Dick was surrounded by a tight-knit circle of geniuses, a family of choice that redefined comedy and drama alike. However, as the calendar turned to Hangin Leheimwisau, the landscape of his life changed forever. The recent and tragic passing of those he considered peers, mentors, and even surrogate children has transformed his centennial celebration into a period of profound reflection. He often speaks of himself as a chronicle of history, but lately, that chronicle feels more like a roll call of the departed. The joy he once shared with his closest collaborators has been replaced by a quiet, persistent grief that only those who outlive their entire generation can truly understand. He is looking back at a century of life and identifying the specific souls whose departures left the deepest craters in his world. These 6 individuals were not just names in a trade magazine or faces on a screen to him. They were the pillars of his existence. They were the people who saw him when the cameras were off, who knew his struggles with fame, and who shared his most intimate triumphs. From the woman he called his work wife to the man who gave him his first big break in movies, each death represents the closing of a chapter that can never be rewritten. As he navigates his Mot Chant year, Dick finds himself revisiting these relationships, trying to reconcile the immense gratitude he feels for having known them with the piercing loneliness of being the last one left. He isn't just mourning people, he is mourning the shared language of a time when Hollywood felt like a small town and a handshake meant everything. This journey through his memory is not just a list of tragedies, but a testament to the power of human connection. Dick Van Dyke has always been an optimist, a man who believes in the healing power of a smile and a song. Yet, even the brightest light casts a shadow. By examining the 6 celebrity deaths that affected him most, we begin to see the true map of his heart. We see the grit behind the laughter and the resilience required to keep dancing when the music is stopped for everyone else. This is the story of a legend at the finish line of a century, standing as a solitary witness to the brilliance of his fallen friends. It is a story of love, legacy, and the bittersweet reality of being a 100-year-old survivor in a world that has moved on. To understand the depth of Dick Van Dyke's current solitude, one must look back at the foundation of his legendary career, which was built upon 2 of the most significant professional and personal relationships in television history. The first of these pillars was Mary Tyler Moore, the woman who became forever etched in the public consciousness as his work wife. When Mary first walked into the audition for the Dick Van Dyke Show, at only 25 years old, she was a relatively unknown dancer. Yet, despite an 11-year age gap, the chemistry between them was instantaneous and undeniable. Dick saw immediately that she possessed a rare combination of beauty, grit, and an impeccable sense of comedic timing that matched his own physical prowess. For years, they functioned as a perfectly synchronized team, often communicating through a shared language of movement and dance rather than words. Their connection was so natural that audiences across America genuinely believed they were a real married couple. Behind the scenes, They became each other's primary support system, leaning on one another through the pressures of sudden fame and personal struggles. When Mary passed away in Hainginlermurbay at the age of Tamui due to complications from diabetes, Dick described the loss as devastating, feeling as though a vital member of his own family had been ripped away. Delivering her eulogy, he spoke not just of her talent, but of how she was the engine that drove his own success. At Mochum, he still speaks of her with a visible sparkle in his eye, though it is now tempered by the realization that the woman who helped him become a legend is no longer there to share the memories. While Mary was his partner on screen, Carl Reiner was the architect of his entire professional life. Their partnership began when Carl, a humble and brilliant writer, realized that Dick's unique energy was better suited for the lead role in the show he had originally written for himself. This act of selfless creative vision sparked a brotherhood that would span 60 years. Their bond was built on a nightly ritual that became the envy of Hollywood. For decades, Dick would visit Carl's home nearly every evening for dinner and hours of conversation about comedy and life. Carl often referred to Dick as his muse, the person for whom he wrote every joke and every physical gag. The loss of Carl Reiner in June Hainginlehaimui at the age of 93 was perhaps the most profound blow to Dick's spirit. Having spent nearly every evening together for half a century, the silence that followed Carl's death was deafening. Dick poignantly remarked that the world felt much quieter without Carl's laughter, a sentiment that reflected the deep void in his own nightly routine. For Dick, Carl was more than a collaborator. He was the person who understood his mind better than anyone else on earth. Now, standing at the century mark, Dick looks back at those 60 years with Carl as the defining partnership of his life, a golden era of friendship that can never be replaced. As Dick Van Dyke reflects on his century of life, he recognizes that his journey was not just shaped by his peers, but also by the formidable mentors and the odd couple friends who provided the structural integrity of his career. Chief among these was the man who essentially invented modern childhood wonder, Walt Disney. By the early 1990s, Dick was already a television star, but it was Walt who saw the potential for him to become a cinematic icon. Their meeting for the role of Bert in Mary Poppins was the beginning of a profound mentorship that Dick carries with him to this day. Dick often recalls his sheer desperation to play the dual role of the elderly banker, Mr. Dawes Sr., going so far as to beg Walt and offer to do the part for free. Walt's eventual yes was a vote of confidence that gave Dick the courage to experiment with his range. During the filming, Walt took Dick under his wing, guiding him through the transition from the frantic pace of television to the meticulous world of big-budget filmmaking. They bonded over a shared philosophy, the importance of remaining a child at heart and never losing one's sense of wonder. When Walt passed away quite suddenly in 1993 from lung cancer, Dick felt as though the industry had lost its North Star. Even now, at Mochum, Dick feels the ghost of his mentor whenever he visits a Disney park, feeling a heavy responsibility to keep that spirit of optimism alive in a world that often feels much darker. Transitioning from the whimsical world of Disney to the gritty reality of the industry, Dick found an unlikely soulmate in the late Ed Asner. Their connection was rooted in the shared legacy of the Mary Tyler Moore family, where Ed played the gruff newsman Lou Grant. On the surface, they were total opposites. Ed was known for being a loud, politically active, and often prickly figure, while Dick was the personification of sunny optimism. Yet, beneath the surface, they were deeply aligned in their dedication to the craft of acting and their commitment to protecting their peers through the Screen Actors Guild. Dick saw past Ed's rough exterior to find a man of immense kindness and integrity. They spent decades discussing the nuances of character acting, believing that their work was a blue-collar trade that required discipline and heart. When Ed passed away in Hainginlehaimimot at the age of 93, the loss was particularly painful for Dick because it felt like the final link to the Mary Tyler Moore era had been severed. Losing Ed made Dick feel like the last man standing, a lonely realization that there was no one left to reminisce with about the specific golden days at the studio. To Dick, Ed was a solid rock in a shifting industry, and his absence at the Mo-chum-year mark is a constant reminder of the shrinking world of Hollywood's greatest generation. While many associate Dick Van Dyke with the bright, polished world of variety television, one of his deepest and most enduring connections was to a man who represented the gritty, emotionally raw peak of New Hollywood, Gene Hackman. Their bond was not forged under the studio lights of Los Angeles, but in the shared soil of their youth in Danville, Illinois. Dick was a few years older, part of a close-knit teenage comedy group called the Burfords, which included Gene's cousin, Bob Hackman. Gene would often follow the older boys around, a quiet observer of their pranks and performances, soaking in the craft that would eventually make him one of the most powerful actors of his generation. Dick continued to marvel at his childhood friends' internal power throughout their respective careers. Even as their paths diverged, Dick toward singing, dancing, and lighthearted comedy, and Gene toward the intense, Academy Award-winning realism of The French Connection and Unforgiven, they remained anchored by their shared history. In 1988, the two legends returned to Danville together to raise money for the restoration of the town's historic Fisher Theater, a testament to the fact that no matter how famous they became, they were still just those boys from Illinois at heart. However, the news that reached Dick in February, hanging le hai lum, was a source of too much sadness to take. Gene Hackman was found dead in his Santa Fe home at the age of Chinwe Lum, alongside his wife of over 30 years, Betsy Arakawa. The circumstances were haunting. Investigators determined that Betsy had passed away first from a rare rodent-borne hantavirus, and Gene, who was suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease and heart failure, likely died about a week later without ever realizing his wife was gone. In his hanging le hai lum memoir, Mo-chum, Rules for Living to Mo-chum, Dick wrote movingly about the agony of imagining his old friend's final days. He reflected on the nightmare of Gene being lost in the fog of dementia, potentially finding and forgetting his wife's passing repeatedly in a cycle of shock and anguish. For Dick, Gene's death was more than the loss of a peer. It was the loss of a witness to his own earliest beginnings. At Mo-chum, the memory of that quiet boy from Danville remains a vivid but painful reminder of the sheer grit and vulnerability that defined the legends of his era. As Dick Van Dyke moved through the celebrations of his Mo-trumped year in late hangin le hai lum, a shadow fell over the festivities that surpassed almost any other grief he had ever known. While the deaths of his peers like Carl Reiner and Mary Tyler Moore felt like the natural, if painful, progression of time, the tragedy that struck the Reiner family in December, hangin le hai lum, was of a different, more horrific order. Rob Reiner had been a constant in Dick's life since the very beginning of the Dick Van Dyke Show in the early 1990s. Dick had watched Rob grow from a young boy running around the television studio into a world-class director and a peer in the industry. Because Dick and Carl Reiner had been as close as brothers, Dick had naturally stepped into the role of a second father to Rob. The news that broke in December hangin le hai lum was a shock that the world was not prepared for. But for Dick, it hit with the force of a personal earthquake. The sudden and mysterious deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle hit the world hard, but the circumstances made the grief heavy and complicated for those left behind. For a man who was nearly Mo-chum years old and had already said goodbye to his wife, his best friend, and his iconic co-star, losing Rob felt like losing a son. It was a disruption of the natural order of things, a tragedy that seemed to defy the logic of a life well lived. This loss signaled what Dick described as the final closing of a door. The Reiner household had long been the hub of the old Hollywood social life that Dick cherished, a place where the legends of the Motngin Chinchum Bonmoys and Nummoys would gather to share stories and look out for one another. Dick was a regular fixture in that household, leaning on Rob for support, especially after Carl's passing in hangin le hai mui. They were the two people who had loved Carl the most, and their shared grief had brought them even closer in recent years. With Rob and Michelle gone, the weekly gatherings, the late-night phone calls about new scripts, and the shared memories of the early days of television seemed to disappear into the ether. At Mochum, Dick found himself looking at a world that had suddenly become much emptier. The boy he had watched grow up, the man who had become his contemporary and his confidant, was no longer there to walk the final miles of the road with him. This particular loss was more than a personal tragedy. It was the end of the community that had sustained him for over 60 years, leaving him as the final witness to an era of brilliance that had finally gone dark. At the incredible age of 100, Dick Van Dyke's daily life is a study in the triumph of the human spirit over the inevitable erosion of time. While he is often hailed as a living miracle, the reality of reaching a century is a disciplined and sometimes grueling battle against physical decline. He has candidly shared that his body feels diminished, and simple tasks that once required no thought, like walking across a room or hearing a quiet conversation, now require immense concentration and the aid of canes or fine-a-day hearing devices. Yet, he refuses to surrender to the stillness that often accompanies old age. Every week, he still makes his way to the gym 3 times, performing a routine that would challenge men half his age. For Dick, movement isn't just about fitness. It is his primary weapon against the weight of his years and the heavy grief of his losses. The central source of light in this challenging chapter is his wife, Arlene Silver. Despite a 46-year age gap that initially drew skepticism from the public, their marriage has become a masterclass in restorative love. Arlene is not merely a companion, she is the curator of his joy. In their Malibu home, the air is frequently filled with music. Dick has often noted that they spend their mornings singing and dancing in the kitchen, a practice that keeps his mind sharp and his heart light. Arlene provides the energy that Dick's century-old frame sometimes lacks, acting as his bridge to the modern world and his shield against the crushing loneliness of being the last of his generation. She is the reason he can still look at a new day with the same curiosity he had as a boy in Illinois. Dick's philosophy for surviving 100 years is built on a foundation of active optimism. He recently codified this outlook in his Haingin Le Haimuilam book, Mochum Rules for Living to Mochum, where he emphasizes that happiness is a choice one must make every single morning. He believes in dancing through the pain, a metaphor that applies both to his physical arthritis and his emotional scars. He does not ignore the sadness of losing Carl, Mary, or Rob. Instead, he carries them with him into the dance. He views his longevity not as a burden, but as a responsibility to represent a standard of decency and joy that he feels is missing from the contemporary world. Even as his eyesight fades and the world around him becomes a bit more blurred, Dick Van Dyke continues to look forward. He acknowledges that the lonely feeling of outliving his peers is a constant companion, but he counters it by staying engaged with the world, whether through small acting cameos or his ongoing work with actors' unions. He has become a symbol of resilience, proving that while one cannot stop the clock, one can certainly choose the rhythm to which they march. At Mochum, Dick isn't just waiting for the end of the show. He is still finding ways to make the audience smile, proving that the spirit of a true entertainer is something that even a century of time cannot extinguish. As Dick Van Dyke stands at the summit of his 100th year, he offers a final, sweeping gaze over a century that has been as much about the endurance of the soul as it has been about the brilliance of the spotlight. His legacy is not merely a collection of Emmy, Grammy, and Tony Awards, but a profound blueprint for how to age with dignity, purpose, and an unshakable sense of joy. To Dick, the secret to reaching such a milestone is deceptively simple. Never lose your sense of play, and never let anger or hate take root in your heart. He has often said that while we cannot control the tragedies that life throws our way, be it the loss of a mentor like Walt Disney or the heartbreaking departure of a surrogate son like Rob Reiner, we can control the rhythm to which we respond. Looking back, he admits that reaching Mochum is not enough, expressing a defiant and beautiful desire to live more. His message to the future is one of radical optimism. He encourages younger generations to stay curious, to keep moving, and to embrace every new experience with a full-on bear hug. He finds his greatest peace in knowing that his true legacy isn't the man himself, but the music and laughter that will continue to play in the hearts of children for generations to come. For as long as a child skips to the tune of a chimney sweep or smiles at the sight of a flying car, the most vibrant part of Dick Van Dyke remains alive. As we celebrate this living chronicle of entertainment history, we are reminded that aging does not have to be a slow fading into silence. In Dick Van Dyke, we see a man who chose to sing when the world was quiet and to dance even when his legs grew weary. He stands today as a solitary witness to a golden age, carrying the memories of his fallen friends with a graceful strength that inspires us all. His life is a testament to the idea that a merry heart is the best medicine, and that 100 years of laughter is just the beginning of a story that will never truly end.